A cop sees a black man sitting alone in the park, assumes he's up to no good, and arrests him. But when he learns the man is actually an undercover FBI agent, his world turns upside down. What happens next will shock you. Stay tuned, and make sure to hit that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping stories like this. It started like any ordinary afternoon, with birds chirping and children laughing in the distance, but in the blink of an eye, the peaceful park transformed into the center of a shocking confrontation. Officer Brent Mallory, a local cop known for his overzealous attitude and suspicious tendencies, was on routine patrol when he spotted a black man sitting alone on a park bench, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, typing something into a small black notebook. Brent narrowed his eyes. In his mind, that combination, black, alone, and writing, triggered every stereotype he carried. "Suspicious behavior," he muttered, clutching his belt as he walked toward the man. Without asking questions or giving a proper greeting, Brent barked, "Hey, what are you doing here?" The man looked up slowly, calmly, his expression unreadable. "Just enjoying the park," he said, closing the notebook. But that wasn't good enough for Brent. "ID now," he demanded. The man raised an eyebrow. "Am I being detained?" he asked. Brent's face tightened. "Don't play games. You people think you're slick." The words hung heavy in the air, charged and bitter. The park suddenly felt colder. The tension between the two men was palpable, thick with misunderstanding, fear, and a dangerous mix of judgment and prejudice. The man, unfazed, didn't reach for his wallet or make any sudden movements. Yet Brent's grip on his belt tightened. "I said, show me your ID." The man didn't flinch, his expression still unreadable. "I'm not giving you anything without knowing why you're detaining me." The cop's face grew redder, his mind swirling with frustration and irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who, in his mind, fit the profile of trouble. "You think you can talk back to me? You're not going anywhere until I say so." The man calmly stood up, his height and posture radiating confidence, but his voice remained steady. "You have no reason to stop me. You're harassing me." Brent's eyes narrowed. That word, harassment, stung. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, not in a park he patrolled daily, not by someone who, in his eyes, didn't belong. "You're being difficult, and that's a problem," Brent said, pulling out his handcuffs. He was prepared to make an example of this man, to show that he was in control, that his authority would not be questioned, especially by someone he thought had no place challenging him. The situation began to escalate quickly. Brent's voice grew louder, demanding compliance as he reached out to grab the man's arm. But before he could secure his grip, a voice called out from behind them. "Brent, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Officer Leslie Carter, Brent's partner, emerged from behind a nearby tree, her eyes wide in disbelief as she saw what was unfolding. She had been watching from a distance, unsure at first what was happening, but the moment she saw Brent's aggression, something clicked. She knew the man on the bench. "Marcus?" Leslie's voice softened in shock, stepping closer. Marcus, the man in the hoodie and sunglasses, didn't respond right away. He turned slightly toward her, his posture relaxed, yet still rigid with the tension of the moment. He didn't need to say anything. His face told her everything. "Is there a problem here?" Leslie asked, looking from Marcus to Brent, her eyes narrowing. Brent, now visibly flustered, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "This guy, he was acting suspicious. I told him to show ID, but he's being difficult." Leslie took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Brent, you're out of line." The words hit Brent harder than he expected. For the first time, doubt crept in, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "What are you talking about? He hasn't done anything but sit there and act like he's above the law." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "Leslie, it's okay. I'll handle it." His words were not for Brent, but for Leslie, signaling that he was prepared to take whatever came next. But Leslie wasn't about to let this go. She stepped forward and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, silently signaling that she was standing with him. "Brent, that's Marcus Greene. Special Agent Marcus Greene, FBI." Leslie's voice cut through the tension like a knife. There was a long pause as the words sank in. Brent stood frozen, his face draining of color. The realization hit him like a freight train. His eyes darted back and forth between Marcus and Leslie, his mind scrambling to piece together the situation that had just spiraled completely out of his control. What? Brent stammered, his voice shaky now. FBI? Leslie nodded, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. Yes, Brent. He's undercover, investigating a major case. And you just tried to arrest him for no reason. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? The silence that followed was suffocating. Brent's mind raced as he processed the information, but his gut twisted with a growing sense of shame. His instincts, driven by ingrained bias, had betrayed him in the most profound way. The man he had assumed to be a threat was, in fact, someone who had spent years protecting people like him. I didn't know, Brent muttered, barely audible. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Marcus stood silently, his expression still unreadable, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had spent years serving his country, working tirelessly to keep the peace, only to be mistaken for a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to reflect now. His career, his integrity, and everything he had worked for had just been called into question in the most public and humiliating way possible. Brent, on the other hand, stood there, his entire world unraveling. He had thought he was doing his job, enforcing the law, but instead, he had violated every principle of justice he swore to uphold. It wasn't just that he had arrested the wrong person, it was the way he had treated Marcus, the way he had dehumanized him. There was no excuse for it. Leslie took a step back, giving Brent space to process what had just happened. I'm reporting this, Brent. You've gone too far this time. The words were like a hammer, striking the final blow. There was no coming back from this. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was now on the line. Marcus, meanwhile, turned to leave, not looking back. There was no need for him to waste any more time here. I'll be in touch, he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. Leslie watched him walk away, her eyes lingering on his back as he disappeared into the distance. There was nothing more to say. Brent had crossed a line. That couldn't be undone. The aftermath was swift. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Video footage of the encounter surfaced online, showing the moment Marcus was wrongfully detained, and the public's reaction was immediate. Outrage, disbelief, anger. People couldn't believe what they had witnessed, how a man simply sitting in a park had been treated as a criminal, all because of his race. As the video went viral, the police department was forced to respond. An internal investigation was launched, and Brent was placed on administrative leave. But for Marcus, there was no satisfaction in seeing his assailant's downfall. It wasn't about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed this to happen repeatedly to people who didn't have the privilege of a badge or the power to demand respect. For him, the battle wasn't won yet. In the weeks that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly to push for accountability, not just for Brent, but for the entire department. He testified in front of city councils, spoke at rallies, and used his position as an agent to advocate for reform. Meanwhile, Brent found himself isolated. His colleagues, once loyal to him, began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had tarnished the badge they all wore. His pride, once unshakable, was replaced with guilt, as he reflected on the choice that had led him down this dark path. The case was just the beginning of a larger conversation about racial profiling, police brutality, and the need for systemic change. For Marcus, it was a painful reminder that even the most trusted authorities were capable of harmful biases, but it was also an opportunity to bring about the change that was so desperately needed. He wasn't just fighting for justice for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been wronged before him and would be wronged after him. And with each step forward, he knew that the road ahead, though challenging, was one he had to walk. For the sake of justice, for the sake of equality, and for the sake of a future where no one would ever have to experience what he had just endured. What had started as a routine interaction quickly spiraled out of control, unfolding in a way that neither the officers involved nor the bystanders could have predicted. The man who introduced himself as Marcus was calm, measured, and respectful, his demeanor unruffled as he answered the officers' questions with quiet dignity. Yet, despite his composed manner, the exchange became increasingly tense, and nothing he said seemed to matter. Officer Brent, seemingly determined to assert control over the situation, insisted that Marcus fit the description of a suspect, though frustratingly, he never once clarified what the crime actually was. Marcus, growing increasingly confused and concerned, politely asked again if he was being detained or if he was free to go. But his question was met not with a simple response, but with an aggressive and unexpected move. Without warning, Brent seized Marcus by the arm, twisting it behind his back in a forceful grip, and slammed him harshly against a nearby park bench. The violence of the moment caught the attention of a couple passing by, and they immediately began filming, their shocked whispers barely audible as one of them muttered, "Unbelievable." It wasn't just the aggression that struck them as wrong. It was the blatant disregard for the fact that Marcus had not shown any resistance, had not done anything to provoke such an escalation. Despite this, Brent remained resolute in his actions, barking orders as he called for backup, his grip tightening on Marcus as if he were already guilty of some undefined crime. The officer's voice, cold and almost clinical, broke the tense silence when he declared, "You're under arrest for obstruction and suspicious behavior." His tone suggested he was certain of his own righteousness, the words rolling off his tongue with an almost smug finality. The handcuffs clicked as he pulled them from his belt, their cold metal a stark reminder of the power dynamic at play. Marcus winced, the sudden pain of his twisted arm momentarily pulling a grimace across his face, but he didn't fight back. His voice, though strained, was clear as he calmly stated, "You're making a mistake. I'm not who you think I am." But despite the sincerity in Marcus's voice, Brent wasn't interested in listening. He had already made up his mind about the situation, had already painted a picture in his mind where he, the officer, was the hero, a protector of the innocent, perhaps, or a vigilant enforcer of some unseen order. The park, in his view, had become a battleground for justice, and Marcus had simply fit the role of the troublemaker. To Brent, the narrative was already set. All that remained was for him to clean up the mess, to enforce his interpretation of justice no matter the truth of the matter. As the sirens of backup vehicles drew nearer, their wailing crescendos filling the air, Brent stood tall with his chest puffed out, his expression one of pride, of satisfaction that he had done his duty. The fact that he was completely unaware of the larger storm he had just set into motion was almost eerie. He didn't recognize that this moment, this decision to escalate what should have been a simple interaction, would have far-reaching consequences. The couple who had been filming exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something was deeply wrong, that they were witnessing an injustice unfold before their eyes. But it wasn't just the onlookers who would bear witness to what was happening. No, what Brent failed to realize was that this incident, this small, seemingly inconsequential moment, was the spark that would ignite a firestorm. The video that had already been recorded would be shared, spread across social media, and would attract the attention of not just local authorities, but the larger community, perhaps even drawing the eye of the national press. As the backup officers arrived, their presence adding to the tension, Marcus was led away, still calm, still trying to explain the misunderstanding, but no one seemed to be listening. He had become just another statistic in a larger pattern of mistreatment, a faceless figure whose rights were trampled in the name of maintaining control. The sirens that had signaled the arrival of backup faded into the distance, leaving behind a trail of questions, of doubts, of voices wondering how it had come to this. For Brent, however, the situation was already over. He had done his job, he thought, without ever questioning whether he had done it right. He had convinced himself that he had been in the right, that his actions had been justified, and that Marcus's insistence on his innocence was nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his suspicious behavior. What Brent had failed to see in his blind certainty was the larger problem: how quickly a situation can escalate when power is wielded without accountability, how easily the innocent can become victims when assumptions are made without question, and how even a small misunderstanding can snowball into something much larger. For Marcus, the experience would not be forgotten. What was intended to be a routine moment in his life, a simple visit to the park, would now be etched in his memory forever. He had been confronted with an officer who had, in his mind, already made up his story, who had already decided who the suspect was before knowing the facts, and who was too caught up in the thrill of power to stop and reconsider. Marcus's life, and the lives of those around him, would be irrevocably changed by this encounter, and the video footage captured by the bystanders would serve as an undeniable testament to the injustice of what had transpired. What Brent hadn't accounted for in his eagerness to make an arrest was that there were people watching, people who would not sit quietly in the face of such obvious wrongdoing. This was not a story that could be easily swept under the rug, and as the fallout began to unfold, it became clear that the events of that day were far from over. The consequences of one man's overzealousness, of his refusal to listen, would reverberate through the community and beyond, sparking discussions about justice, accountability, and the fine line between protecting the public and abusing power. The video of Marcus's arrest would go viral, and the questions would mount. How many other incidents like this had occurred without anyone speaking up? How many other people had been subjected to the same treatment, the same disregard for their humanity? The story of what happened that day, seen through the lens of the recording, would be dissected by pundits, debated by activists, and analyzed by those who demanded answers. For Marcus, the road ahead would not be easy. He would have to navigate the aftermath of this encounter, which could potentially lead to legal action or public scrutiny. But there was one thing that was certain. The world would see what had happened to him, and with the evidence in the form of video footage, his story would be harder to dismiss. As for Brent, the realization would eventually set in, though perhaps too late, that the storm he had walked into had nothing to do with a troublemaker in the park. It was a larger issue, one that called into question the very systems of power and authority, and it was a lesson that, unfortunately, too many had to learn the hard way. The events of that day would not be forgotten, nor would the lessons they held about justice, fairness, and the responsibility that came with wielding power. When the backup arrived, Officer Leslie Carter stepped out of her squad car and froze as she saw the man in handcuffs. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she recognized him. "Marcus?" she asked, her voice thick with surprise and concern. The question hung in the air as she stared at the man in custody. Brent, still standing tall and proud after making the arrest, looked at her with confusion written across his face. "You know this guy?" he asked, clearly unaware of the man he had just detained. Leslie nodded slowly, her expression shifting from shock to a more serious, almost cautious demeanor. "That's Special Agent Marcus Greene. He's FBI," she said, the words hitting Brent like a punch to the gut. The shock in his eyes was palpable, his confidence in the situation rapidly crumbling as he stammered, "What? No way!" But Leslie wasn't done. Without another word, she stepped forward, her movements swift and decisive as she immediately began unfastening the handcuffs, her fingers working with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I've worked with him before. He's on a task force. What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice low but urgent. Brent stood frozen, unable to respond, his mind scrambling to process the realization of what he had just done. Marcus, finally free from the oppressive grip of the handcuffs, rubbed his wrists and turned to look directly at Brent, his voice calm, yet tinged with the weariness of someone who had been unjustly wronged. "I tried to tell him," Marcus said, his words heavy with the weight of frustration, his gaze unwavering. "But he didn't want to listen." The air between them was thick with tension, a silence settling over the park that felt almost suffocating. The bystanders, who had been quietly filming and murmuring in disbelief, suddenly became louder, their comments tinged with the kind of vindication that only comes from witnessing an injustice being corrected. "Serves him right," one of them muttered, the words laced with quiet satisfaction. Another voice followed, its tone cutting through the awkward silence. "That's what you get for judging someone by their skin." The words stung in the air, a sharp reminder of the assumptions that had led to this entire situation. Brent stood there, his posture still rigid, but his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. The smugness that had marked his earlier actions had evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of his realization. His assumptions, his snap judgment, had not only been wrong, but had also led to an embarrassing and potentially career-threatening misstep. He had arrested an FBI agent, someone with a legitimate role in law enforcement, and now, as the bystanders' voices grew louder and their judgments more pointed, he found himself the object of ridicule and scorn. The tables had turned so swiftly that it left him reeling, his mind struggling to catch up with the unfolding events. The shift in power was palpable. Where he had once held the upper hand, now he was the one who had to answer, the one who was exposed. The crowd around them seemed to sense it too, their collective energy now directed at him rather than Marcus. His authority, which he had wielded so easily moments earlier, now seemed fragile, like a glass house shattering under the weight of the truth. The confidence with which he had made the arrest had been entirely predicated on assumptions that, in hindsight, were embarrassingly unfounded. The crowd's comments, though brief, carried the sting of a larger truth that Brent had failed to see. His judgment had been clouded by bias, by preconceived notions of who Marcus was based on his appearance, rather than any real evidence or reason. The silence that had once surrounded the park was now filled with whispers, murmurs of disbelief, and the distinct sound of the crowd's shifting loyalties. Brent's mind raced, but there was no way to undo what had already been done. The damage had been done in full view of the public, and though Leslie was there to help fix the immediate mistake, there was no erasing the fact that Brent had just humiliated himself, and, more importantly, had violated the trust of someone who had every right to expect respect and dignity. As Marcus stood, rubbing his wrists, he remained calm, composed despite the painful memory of the unjust arrest. He had done everything he could to de-escalate the situation, to clarify who he was, but it had fallen on deaf ears. Now, with his freedom returned, he looked at Brent with a mixture of pity and disappointment, his words no longer a plea but a simple fact. "I tried to tell him," he repeated, as though offering a quiet commentary on the absurdity of the situation. Brent's face flushed, the weight of his mistake settling into his chest. He had let his pride and quick assumptions dictate his actions, and now the consequences were unfolding before him. The bystanders, once passive observers, had now become active participants in the narrative. Their earlier murmurs of disbelief had turned into open judgment, and in this moment, their voices felt more powerful than ever. Brent's authority had been stripped away, not just by Leslie's intervention, but by the overwhelming truth that he had been wrong, that his assumptions had led him to criminalize an innocent man. As the onlookers continued to film and comment, Brent couldn't help but feel exposed. His every move was now scrutinized, and in the age of smartphones and social media, there was no hiding from the truth. The video footage would be shared far and wide, a permanent record of his failure. What had started as a simple arrest had turned into a public spectacle, one that would be dissected and discussed for days, weeks, perhaps even longer. For Marcus, the experience was just another painful reminder of the biases that existed within the system, of how easy it was for an innocent man to be caught in the crossfire of someone's prejudices. But for Brent, this moment was something far worse. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a moment of reckoning. As Leslie continued to speak to him, offering him a chance to explain, the crowd's whispers only grew louder, and Brent found himself questioning how he had gotten here, how he had failed so spectacularly, how his assumptions had led him down, a path that no amount of authority could justify. In that moment, the truth had come out, and with it, a sobering lesson about the danger of judgment and the consequences of failing to listen. Within hours of the arrest, the video had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. The footage, a stark and undeniable display of a black man being unjustly detained and forcibly handled by a white police officer, ignited a storm of outrage that swept the nation. Hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and "Power Profiling Exposed" trended at the top of social media platforms, and the clip was replayed repeatedly on news outlets, becoming a symbol of systemic abuse and racial profiling. The public's reaction was swift and relentless. Calls flooded in demanding accountability, not only for the officer who had made the arrest, but for the institution that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked for so long. In the wake of the video's virality, the police department issued a weak defensive statement, claiming that the arrest had been a misunderstanding and that the officer had been following protocols. But the damage was already done. The narrative had already been set. No amount of damage control could erase the image of a man, calm and respectful, being violently subdued for no reason other than the color of his skin. Marcus, despite the ordeal he had endured, remained composed in interviews, but his words cut deep, offering not just his perspective, but a broader, unflinching truth. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly, his voice steady and resolute. "This happens every day to people who don't have a badge to protect them." His statement resonated with a public that had seen too many similar incidents play out, often with the victims never receiving justice or recognition. Meanwhile, Officer Brent, now at the center of an internal investigation, was placed on suspension, pending a review of the events. The once untouchable officer, whose years of service had shielded him from scrutiny and allowed him to wield his power without question, now found himself under intense pressure, with his reputation unraveling in the face of the overwhelming public outcry. Colleagues who had once respected him, who had perhaps turned a blind eye to his behavior in the past, began to distance themselves, unwilling to stand by him in the wake of the scandal. Some rushed to defend him, claiming he had simply made a mistake, that he had been following his instincts as a law enforcement officer. But others, perhaps those who had long questioned the culture of their department, saw in his actions the same old patterns of discrimination and abuse that had been ignored for far too long. The tide of public opinion was shifting, and Brent was no longer a figure of authority. He had become a symbol, one that represented everything that was wrong with the system. The system that had allowed his unchecked assumptions, his failure to listen, and his disregard for basic human dignity to go unchallenged for so many years, was now being scrutinized more closely than ever before. Brent was no longer seen as a cop in control of a situation. He was a man caught in the crossfire of a larger movement that was demanding change. The incident had brought long-simmering issues to the forefront, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which law enforcement, as an institution, had perpetuated a culture of racism and bias. The scandal was not just about a single incident, it was about a systemic failure, one that had been ignored for far too long. Marcus's experience, which had begun as a personal injustice, had become a rallying cry for a larger conversation about policing, racial profiling, and accountability. His calm demeanor in the face of such an outrageous violation of his rights only served to amplify his message. He had become not just a victim of this particular officer's actions, but a representative of the countless others who had suffered in silence or had their stories go unheard. As the days passed, Brent's position continued to erode. His suspension loomed over him, a constant reminder that his once unassailable position of power was no longer guaranteed. Colleagues, community leaders, and even the public were questioning the systems that had enabled his actions and the culture that had allowed him to believe that he could act with impunity. His reputation, once built on years of service and authority, had been torn apart by a single, preventable mistake. His career, which had seemed so secure, was now teetering on the edge, vulnerable to the weight of public scrutiny and internal investigation. As the pressure mounted, it became clear that this was no longer just a story about one officer's failure. It was about the reckoning that had arrived for the police force as a whole. The conversation about accountability, transparency, and the need for reform was no longer a distant issue. It was front and center, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Brent's colleagues, many of whom had known him for years, began to look at him differently. Some of them were shaken, realizing that they had overlooked signs of a deeper problem within the department. Others, perhaps more disillusioned by the events unfolding, began to ask themselves hard questions about their own roles in perpetuating a system that allowed officers like Brent to act without question. In the days following the incident, the police department was forced to confront the mounting pressure. Internal reviews were initiated, and public protests calling for change intensified. The department's handling of the situation was put under a microscope, with many questioning whether they would take meaningful action or simply return to business as usual. Meanwhile, Marcus, who had been thrust into the public eye in the most unfortunate of circumstances, continued to speak out with poise and conviction. His message was clear. This wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about a larger, systemic issue that needed to be addressed. He had become an unwilling but powerful symbol of the fight for justice and equality, and his words were being heard far beyond the confines of the park where the incident had occurred. As the weeks passed, the fallout from the video continued to reverberate, and Brent, once a respected member of his department, found himself isolated and under intense scrutiny. The public's demands for justice, the voices calling for reform, and the questions being raised about the practices within law enforcement were impossible to ignore. And though Brent's future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The world had changed, and the time for reckoning had arrived. The incident in the park had become a flashpoint in the larger conversation about racial injustice, police accountability, and the need for significant change. The video had exposed the ugliness of racial profiling and abuse of power, and it was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. The world was watching, and the spotlight was now on Brent and the police department that had failed to take responsibility for his actions. As the investigation into the arrest of Marcus Greene unfolded, a troubling pattern of behavior from Officer Brent came to light, further complicating the already tense situation. Complaints from other citizens, particularly people of color, began to surface, and they painted a deeply troubling picture of Brent's actions over the years. Many of these complaints had been dismissed in the past due to a lack of evidence or inconclusive findings. But now, with the spotlight shining on him and his actions under scrutiny, they could no longer be ignored. One woman came forward with a story about being pulled over for a minor infraction, a broken taillight, and being treated with hostility and suspicion, as if she were a criminal. Another man, a young black man, recalled a time when Brent had followed him for several blocks simply because he was wearing a hoodie, an innocent act that had apparently drawn Brent's unwanted attention. These accounts, once brushed aside, were now part of a mounting case against Brent, painting a clear picture of bias and misconduct that had gone unchecked for far too long. As more and more people came forward with their stories, Brent's once pristine record, which had been built over years of service, began to crumble. His actions no longer seemed like isolated incidents, but part of a larger, deeply ingrained pattern of racial profiling and discrimination that had been tolerated within the department. Meanwhile, Marcus, who had become the symbol of both personal injustice and a larger societal issue, revealed in a press conference that he had not been in the park that day by accident. Far from simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Marcus had been there for a legitimate and important reason. He was investigating a white-collar crime involving illegal property dealings. The investigation was connected to a wealthy developer, someone who had made significant donations to the same precinct where Brent worked. This revelation, dripping with irony, added another layer of complexity to an already explosive situation. "I wasn't just minding my business," Marcus said during the press conference, his tone calm but resolute, his words carefully measured. "I was doing my job, a job to protect and serve justice, but I was treated like a threat before I could even open my mouth." His statement was a powerful reminder of the bias that had shaped the entire interaction, and it struck a chord with the public. What had begun as a story about one police officer's error in judgment was now a much larger and more disturbing tale about the systems that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. The story was no longer about a single cop acting out of line. It had become about the systemic issues within law enforcement, about how certain officers were allowed to operate with impunity, and about how the system, from the top down, had failed to address these deep-seated issues. Marcus's words reverberated with many who had experienced similar biases at the hands of law enforcement, especially those who had seen their experiences minimized or dismissed for years. His calm and measured response, despite the mistreatment he had endured, only added to the strength of his message. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity, he was fighting for a larger cause, a cause that transcended his personal experience and spoke to the widespread injustices that people of color faced every day at the hands of a biased system. The attention now focused on Brent and his actions had become a microcosm of a much larger conversation that was unfolding across the nation. The investigation into Brent's behavior revealed not just one officer's failure, but the failure of a system that had allowed such behavior to persist for so long. The police department, now under intense pressure to respond, found itself grappling with a larger reckoning about the culture within its ranks. Questions were being asked about training, about oversight, and about the way the department had handled complaints in the past. Why had these stories been ignored for so long? Why had complaints about Brent's behavior been dismissed so easily? The answers were becoming clear. Because they were inconvenient, because they didn't fit the narrative of a police force that saw itself as above reproach. As the investigation into Brent's actions deepened, the public's outrage grew. People demanded justice not only for Marcus, but for every individual who had been mistreated or unfairly targeted by Brent or others like him. The hashtag #JusticeForMarcus gained even more traction, and protests calling for police accountability and systemic reform became more frequent. It wasn't just Brent's career that was on the line anymore. It was the larger issue of police reform, the need for real change, and the desire to hold officers accountable for their actions. The department, struggling to maintain control of the narrative, found itself defending not just one officer's mistake, but the very culture that had allowed such a mistake to happen in the first place. Marcus, on the other hand, became a symbol of resistance against the unchecked power of law enforcement, using his voice and his position to shed light on the deeper issues within the system. His insistence that the situation was not just about him but about the broader issue of racial profiling and systemic bias resonated deeply with those who had long been fighting for change. His message had become a call to action, a call for justice, for accountability, and for a fundamental shift in the way the police interacted with the communities they were supposed to protect. The revelation of Marcus's investigation only deepened the irony of the situation, highlighting how deeply entwined the forces of power and privilege could be. The wealthy developer tied to the illegal property dealings had been a major donor to the precinct, a fact that cast a shadow over Brent's actions and suggested that the officer's biases may have been fueled by more than just personal prejudice. It raised uncomfortable questions about the ways in which wealth, influence, and power shaped the way law enforcement operated, particularly when it came to the treatment of people of color. Marcus's calm in the face of such adversity only made his message stronger. He wasn't just a victim of one officer's actions. He had become a spokesperson for a larger movement, one that demanded systemic change, one that called out the ingrained biases that continued to poison law enforcement practices. His words, though spoken in the immediate aftermath of the incident, had lasting power, echoing through the media, through protests, and through the halls of government offices where decisions about policing were made. Marcus had gone from an innocent man caught in an officer's misjudgment to a figure of significant public importance, and his influence continued to grow as more and more people took up the cause for justice. In the end, the story of Marcus and Brent wasn't just about an individual arrest gone wrong. It was a critical turning point in the ongoing conversation about racial inequality, police reform, and the need for an overhaul of the justice system. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the system that enabled them. And as the investigation continued, as the public demanded answers, and as Marcus's message spread, it became clear that the change so many had been fighting for was beginning to take shape. What had started as a simple mistake had become the catalyst for something much bigger, something that could lead to real, lasting change. In the weeks following the viral video and the public outcry, the consequences for Officer Brent were swift and severe. He was officially removed from duty, a move that was intended to signal that the department was taking the matter seriously. The police chief issued a public apology, acknowledging the harm that had been done and vowing to take steps to ensure that such an incident would never occur again. As part of this commitment, a new initiative was launched within the department to implement anti-bias training, a clear acknowledgement that the systemic issues within the force needed to be addressed. However, Marcus, despite accepting the apology, remained steadfast in his belief that apologies alone were insufficient. He made it clear at a packed community forum that the issue at hand was not about one officer offering an apology for his actions. It was about ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated and that a culture of accountability was instilled in law enforcement. "It's not about one man saying sorry," Marcus stated firmly, his voice carrying the weight of the truth. "It's about making sure this never happens again." His words resonated with the crowd, and his unwavering stance on the need for real, lasting change became the foundation for his subsequent role in shaping policy. Soon after, Marcus was invited to lead a joint task force that aimed to improve community relations with law enforcement. This task force, with Marcus at the helm, sought to bring his experience as an FBI agent and his deep understanding of the challenges facing marginalized communities into direct policy changes that could potentially shift the culture within the police force. His involvement in this initiative gave him an opportunity to turn his painful experience into a force for positive transformation, to ensure that no one else would have to go through what he had endured. Meanwhile, the case of Marcus Greene and Officer Brent became a case study in academies and legal circles, where it was examined in detail as an example of racial profiling and the broader need for police reform. Law students and future law enforcement officers were taught about the incident as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of respecting civil rights, and the urgent need for reforms that could dismantle the patterns of bias that so often pervade police work. As for Brent, after his removal from duty, he seemed to vanish from the public eye. Reports indicated that he had moved away from the area and was seeking counseling, likely in an attempt to process what had happened and to reflect on his actions. Some claimed that he was beginning to see the error of his ways, that he was grappling with the weight of his mistakes and the consequences of his behavior. Others, however, felt that it was too little, too late, that the damage had been done, and that the system that had allowed him to act with such impunity had now been exposed for all to see. Regardless of where Brent's journey would take him, the community's focus had shifted squarely onto Marcus, who had become a quiet hero in the eyes of many. His heroism was not born out of his position as an FBI agent or his law enforcement background. It was rooted in the way he handled the injustice he faced. With strength, dignity, and clarity, Marcus had remained resolute in the face of adversity, never allowing the injustice he experienced to define him or derail his purpose. He stood firm in his belief that accountability, not just for one officer, but for the system as a whole, was the key to meaningful change. He never sought personal glory or recognition. His focus was always on the larger goal of justice and reform. It was this unwavering commitment to what was right that made him a hero in the eyes of the community, a symbol of the kind of integrity and courage that transcends any badge or uniform. His story, one of personal injustice and public transformation, served as a reminder to all that true authority is not derived from the power granted by an institution. It is earned through the strength of one's character, the clarity of one's convictions, and the courage to stand up for justice, even when the odds are stacked against you. In a world where power is often abused and authority can be blind, Marcus's example became a beacon of hope and a call to action for all those who sought a more just and equitable society. His journey, though born from pain and frustration, became a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most profound impact comes not from the force of a badge, but from the force of one person's resolve to stand up against injustice. As we wrap up this powerful story, remember that true strength lies not in holding power over others, but in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Marcus Greene's journey reminds us that accountability, integrity, and courage can create lasting change, and we all have a role to play in that. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the importance of justice and reform, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more impactful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. We can make a difference together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.